Football is America's game. The fast, high-energy, high-contact sport is a national pastime that's beloved by millions. This past February, nearly 100 million viewers tuned into Super Bowl 54 between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers, according to research firm Nielsen. 2020 also marks 100 years in existence for the National Football League. It was founded in the fall of 1920, and today it's grown into a dynamic multi-billion-dollar entity made up of 32 individual teams split into two conferences, the American Football Conference and the National Football Conference.
Football is by far the most popular and financially successful major sport in the United States, given that its origins were fairly ramshackle, and it took a long time for the National Football League to establish itself as a major presence on the sporting scene.
That's Dr. Rob Ruck, a professor of sports history at the University of Pittsburgh. Ruck says that one of the reasons the NFL appeals to a wide following is an even playing field across small and large cities alike.
The NFL had really pioneered in creating greater competitive balance, allowing franchises in cities like Green Bay and Buffalo and Cincinnati and Kansas City and Pittsburgh to compete on a relatively equal footing with franchises in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. And they did that by establishing a draft of players coming out of college, by scheduling in ways that allowed the weaker teams to have better records late in the season, by splitting more of the gate in a way that allowed the smaller market teams to prosper. And then, what was probably the most significant step they ever took was agreeing to share broadcast revenues equally.
More than half of the league's annual revenue of roughly $15 billion comes from TV broadcasting deals. This dominance and profitability in TV viewership dates back to key decisions made in the late 50s and early 60s by then NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle.
One of the interesting things about him is that previous commissioners had a background in sports. They were coaches or they owned a team. And Pete Rozelle's background was in marketing and public relations. And so one of the things that he really wanted to do was to create a brand for the league, to create different, what we might call like touch points between the league and consumers, and to create kind of an identity for the league that set it apart from other sports.
That's Dr. Travis Vogan, an associate professor of American Studies at the University of Iowa. Vogan specializes in the intersection of sports media and U.S. culture. He says that Rozelle really sparked the fire for football by focusing on branding. This meant creating merchandise for each team and the start of an in-house production company called NFL Films.
You have this league-owned organization that's making these documentaries that are celebrating the league and that are on TV throughout the rest of the week. Because at the time, this was before ESPN, obviously before the internet, you would only see football on TV when a live game was on. And so you weren't seeing highlights constantly. And these NFL Films programs were syndicated. And so, folks could basically, purchase the rights to air them. And then all of a sudden football was on throughout the week and in the summer. Right, and so you're starting to get this awareness of football, but an awareness that represents it in a very specific and romanticized way. And other sports didn't have that kind of infrastructure, at least not at that point.
NFL Films produced movies and documentaries that glorified football as an all-American sport and celebrated the sheer athleticism of the players. This constant feed of play-by-plays and commentary on the game led to a bigger following and thus greater revenue for the NFL and higher salaries for athletes. Dr. Kurt Kemper, a professor of history at Dakota State University, highlights that early in the league's history, many players actually turned down the opportunity to play.
In 1958, when the Baltimore Colts won the NFL title, there were players on that team who had jobs during the winter. In fact, one of the Earl Morrall, the running back, he was a beer distributor in Baltimore. So it was not something that allowed for full-time annual income in the 50s still. it was not at all uncommon for students to turn down NFL draft picks in the 50s, particularly if they had a very good college degree and could expect to earn good money in the private sector. We often forget that some of the earliest Heisman Trophy winners were drafted by the NFL and actually turned it down. So the money in the 60s then began to create in college players an aspiration that this was merely a stopover point on the way to football stardom and celebrity and money at the pro level.
Today, this picture looks much different, with football players receiving many millions to join or continue playing for a team. Aaron Rodgers, the longtime quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, pulls in roughly $33 million per year. Patrick Mahomes, the quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, is a top earner in the league, receiving around $45 million. And pay isn't the only factor that's drastically shifted. The demographics of the league look entirely different, too. Unlike in the early days of football, African Americans now make up the majority of players. What's another dominant group? American Samoans. Ruck ties the infusion of football into American Samoa to a post-Pearl Harbor landscape that brought U.S. culture into the territory.
There were more U.S. military personnel on the island than Samoans, and that exposed Samoans to American culture, American ways of doing things, to a wage labor economy. And by then and afterwards, as more and more Samoans left and ended up in Hawaii and California, the children, like any group of immigrants, grew up wanting to fit in, wanting to Americanize, and sport was the vehicle for that.
Within U.S. borders, football has a strong infrastructure as a sport. School-age kids from all across the country participate in intensive youth football programs, carrying them into high school play and, if they're good enough, college football and beyond. However, Ruck says that this distribution of athletes from different backgrounds is skewed towards one distinct class.
If you look at the demographics of who plays football at youth levels, it's increasingly the sport of working and poor Americans, not of better off Americans.
For many at every level of the game, football offers the hope of a brighter future. While the sport has been part of some controversy in recent years, the NFL continues to prosper. Bogan says that the league itself is a powerful entity and, despite the criticism, still holds many of its conventional roots.
They're a pretty traditional organization, and you can see that in a lot of ways that they present themselves, a lot of ways that they sort of commonly wrap themselves in the flag. And I think that the NFL is concerned about trying to maintain its fan base and also not alienate younger people especially, but also folks across different racial identities. And I think that's a challenge for them because, they're kind of trying to have it both ways.
It's no secret that social justice movements and long-term health risks associated with the game have dominated sports headlines. However, Kemper does not believe that the NFL is at risk of fading out from popular culture anytime soon.
They're immensely successful. They're immensely profitable. If we think about it as in classic market terms, they are an industry that continues to attract the topmost level of talent. They compensate them at levels far in excess of market averages, and their product faces very little competition in the marketplace, and consumers gobble it up.
Sports in whole, whether it's football, baseball, or basketball, is a big part of what it means to be an American. In the end, fans from all different backgrounds and beliefs come together to root for a singular team because of their love of the game. You can learn more about the history of football, the NFL, and all three of our guests and their respective publications at viewpointsradio.org. To get more behind the scenes, follow Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
For those who qualify for Medicare, fall open enrollment is underway now. If you pay out of pocket for prescription drugs, choosing the right Medicare prescription drug plan can help save money. Picking a plan that fits your needs can be a simple process with these tips and by working with a trusted partner like Walgreens, who has a number of tools available online and in store. First, evaluate your plan every year as coverage and benefits change. Also, talking to an independent insurance broker can help, which is why Walgreens teamed up with eHealth, an independent fully licensed insurance broker, to offer free advice, which may save you hundreds of dollars and no obligation to enroll. Last, check if your pharmacy is in your plan's preferred network. A Walgreens pharmacist can help lower costs by finding generic alternatives or a lower-cost brand name medicine to treat the same condition. Visit walgreens.com/MEDD to learn more and get started. That's walgreens.com/MEDD.
As many as 89% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients are at risk of a complication called cytokine storm, a leading cause of COVID death. But there's good news. Hospitals across the U.S. are enrolling patients in a trial evaluating lemzilumab, an investigational treatment designed specifically to stop this storm, even with only 1 day of treatment. Dr. Cameron Durant, CEO of Humanigen, the company developing lemzilumab.
Having a therapeutic that can significantly reduce the time to recovery from COVID-19 and send patients home earlier could dramatically impact the arc of this pandemic.
Participating in the study means access to a potential treatment option in addition to standard of care therapies. Trial participant Mark Baranski shares his experience.
I don't know if I received lemzilumab or not, but I viewed the trial as doing everything I could for my recovery while contributing to the fight against COVID-19. I certainly encourage others to do the same.
To learn more and find this trial near you, visit StopStorm.com. That's StopStorm.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
There were police officers coming 80 miles an hour down the street from every possible angle you can imagine. We were trying to get kids out of the street because kids were almost zombie-like, like walking back towards the school.
Revisiting the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. Then,
a third of all marriages today in the United States were generated by matches made online. I think that's a perfectly good thing, but it's a different thing.
The sweeping societal changes in a tech-driven landscape. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.